evaluating pro-immigration as well as anti-immigration talking points, starting out with no one is illegal on stolen land. Look, you hear this one very often, and I just flatly disagree with it. If you are not able to protect something, whether that's land, the chain on your neck, your car, it's not really yours. That might sound cruel, that might sound vicious, animalistic, but if you, or the state, you know, the military, the police often defend things for Americans. But if you're not able to defend something, it's not really yours. If somebody in the jungle can come up and take your shoes, then they are that person's shoes. They're not your shoes anymore. It's unfortunate. Maybe it's mean. Maybe it's unfair. But that's the reality of the world. Those who control force control the world. Now, something that I don't really ever hear brought up, at least not very often, is we have countries like Japan that are very nationalistic. They have very low immigration rates. And like the United States, Japan has had multiple wars fighting for that land. So if Japan stole the land from another group, which was Asian, does that mean that that group that was Asian that Japan stole the land from can return at any point and just take a home? Not really. That's not how we discuss anything. You know, people win the land, and assuming they can continue to defend it, they can make laws in terms of who they want to come onto the land, who they want to kick out of the land, who they want to put in jail. So overall, I'm not a big fan of that argument. Now on to the anti-immigration first argument. The immigrants are causing crime. Look, you hear this one all the time. This is what Trump starts out with. This is what J.D. Vance starts out with. This is what Fox News starts out with. And once again, I just don't agree. The statistics do not bear this out. Illegal immigrants from the Cato Institute, from really every single study that you can get your hands on, illegal immigrants are either slightly less likely to commit a violent crime, not crossing the border, because look, I'm not. Obviously, if you're going to count crossing the border as a crime, then we have to count jaywalking as a crime. We have to count speeding as a crime. We have to count so many different things as a crime, and then everybody's a criminal. So I'm speaking about violent crimes. Illegal immigrants statistically are not more likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. Now, if you want to go with the argument, and I hear a lot of people say this when they learn that fact and accept that fact, what a lot of people go with is, well, they shouldn't be here anyways, and any crime committed by them, even if it's less than a natural-born citizen, is bad. And I do understand that, but if that's our basis, then if we're going to judge the entire group based on the actions of a few, are all white people bad, or because some white people do bad things, or all men bad because some men do bad things? I find that argument ridiculous. And even if that was the case, let's say hypothetically illegal immigrants started committing more crime than native-borns, there's a strong correlation to poverty to crime. So it might not necessarily be the fact that they're illegal immigrants. It might be the fact that they're poor leading to them committing crimes. So I don't really think on multiple bases, I don't think this argument stands up. I think both the pro-immigration as well as the anti-immigration, my first argument for both of them, fail. Now, another pro-immigration, that was an anti-immigration, this is a pro-immigration talking point. Who will work the farms? You know, this is the old school, who will pick the cotton? And I find just on the face, it sounds kind of absurd. You know, obviously when you hear who's going to, do the farm work, I immediately think of like, this sounds like a slave owner. And look, Americans will work these jobs. At the end of the day, Americans will work these jobs. Now, they're not going to work on the farms for $3 an hour. They're not going to work 80 hours a week, but they will work these jobs for good wages that can support a family. And that's all these Americans are asking for. You know, I see people scoff at this idea all the time, oh, why aren't you working on the farms? This farm's hiring. It's like, these people will work if given a good opportunity. Americans are not going to be taking slave jobs, and they shouldn't. That shouldn't be the bar, is because these, abusive owners of businesses want to take advantage of these illegals, as well as visa holders, as well as even legal immigrants who are willing to have a lower quality of life. That shouldn't be the standard. Americans are supposed to come first. So these employers need to pay a fair wage to Americans. That should be the priority. And look, illegal immigration, now the visas, came a little bit before that, but illegal immigration at these levels, where we have like 10% of the population as illegal immigrants, this is a modern thing. So to say that, well, who's going to work this job or who's going to work that job, who's going to build the homes, who was building the homes in 1992? Americans. It's not that complicated, and the homes were cheaper back then. Now, obviously factoring for inflation, they weren't that much cheaper, but you get the point. I find this who's going to work the farms kind of ridiculous, and it's also kind of there's definitely a power imbalance. These people, they want to come to America for a better life, and I do respect them for that for sure. But these owners of the businesses, whether it's a visa holder, whether it's a legal immigrant, they have a lot of power over these employees, and oftentimes they abuse them. So I find that irreprehensible as well. Now, an anti-immigration talking point, the second one, the immigrants are leeching off our system. Look, once again, this is just not bared out by the statistics. Now, are illegal immigrants, as well as just immigrants in general, even if it's a legal immigrant in the first 5 years, are they technically draining the system? Yes. But that's the case for any low-wage worker. People making under $60,000 a year, that's about the tipping point. It's like $60,000 to $70,000 depending on what state you're in. Those people are a drain on the system. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean financially. They are taking more resources on average than people that make above $70,000 are. And that's not really them being a legal immigrant. They're stealing from stuff. Illegal immigrants, they pay inflation tax, they pay sales tax, sometimes they pay W-2 tax. It's tough to really say because that's committing Social Security fraud. But at the end of the day, look, illegal immigrants pay taxes. They probably take out more taxes than they pay. I will acknowledge that. But it's a drop in the bucket. If we're being totally honest, the amount that illegal immigrants are taking versus what they're bringing in terms of taxes, and a lot of taxes we don't know about because they can't legally pay W-2, it's probably a wash. There's a chance that it's literally they're paying more into the system than they're taking, but most likely they're taking more than they put in, but it's not by much. It's not significant. It's not relevant. It's such a small amount. It's completely asinine to say, oh, they're coming here to maybe get universal health care in California. It's like, what? If these states were giving away universal health care to illegals, why wouldn't I just go to the hospital and say I'm an illegal and get the free? It doesn't even make sense. So are they leeching off the system? Maybe. But that would be the same thing for anyone making under 70,000 or anyone under 30 years old. It's like, yeah, they're not making enough money to be a net positive. So I find that argument kind of ridiculous. Now onto a pro-immigration. But we cause the issues in these countries from war, from taking oil, from destabilizing by kicking out a dictator, nation building. And I think this is a very good pro-immigration argument. Look, I fully believe that it is up to the citizens in the United States, in any country, to decide who comes into the country. I think that's perfectly within their right. But I also think there is kind of a natural law of nature that says that if we put a president in and that president bombs the country, blows up all the homes, the roads, the infrastructure, everything, we kind of are obligated to help those people. The least we could do is give them a chance in the United States. Now, if anything, we should be giving them homes, because it's like, you're going to drop a bomb on my home and kill half my family. The least you could do is let me immigrate to your country. So I do think that's a very solid pro-immigration point. If we are, we're destroying Venezuela. If we're going to take Venezuela's oil and damage their economy, they have every right to be upset with us, and they have every right to want to immigrate here and take advantage of the fruits that were their countries. So I do think that's a solid argument. Now, I am very non-interventionist. I'm very anti-war, so I don't really think this should be an issue. But under our current framework, this unfortunately is an issue. Now, an anti-immigration talking point. They are suppressing the wages. Look, this is a very strong argument, and it's bared out in the statistics. Now, I did see a debate on Jubilee with Mehdi Hassan and some right-wing people. And, even Mehdi Hassan, who's very pro-immigration, did acknowledge that immigrants, whether it's illegal, visa holders, or legal, it doesn't really matter. When you have, hypothetically speaking, if you have 10 jobs and 10 Americans, there's relatively an even power distribution, because every job needs to hire somebody, but every person needs a job, so it's relatively fair. When you bring in 3 illegals and 4 visa holders and 8 legal immigrants, there will be more jobs. So there might go from 10 jobs to 12 jobs, but the amount of immigrants that come don't offset that difference. So now the illegals are willing to undercut, the visa holders are willing to undercut, and the legals are willing to undercut. So now the Americans, if they don't want to be unemployed and starve, they have to be willing to accept lower wages and have less power in the workplace. And sometimes, for example, like Mehdi Hassan, who I brought up, he is an example of an immigrant who helped the workers, because he's one immigrant and he comes in and he creates a lot of jobs. So, for example, there are some immigrants that do help the economy from a worker standpoint, giving workers more power and creating jobs. But the average immigrant is suppressing wages. And we can see this in literally every industry that we see an influx of illegal immigration as well as visa holders. And even if, some people use the example of tech, where tech has seen a growth of 1 or 2% in terms of wages, every year since COVID. And people say, oh, well, there's immigrants in that. We've got a bunch of Indians that are on visas, and we've got a bunch of legal immigrants that come over that are Indian. And even if hypothetically we acknowledge those numbers are up 1 or 2%, that's still below inflation. And regardless of, even if they were up above inflation, even if the wages were up 10%, they would be up more because the workers would have more power. If half the employees at your job quit, you automatically have more bargaining power. Now, are your wages going to double? Not necessarily. And are your wages going to go up at all? Not necessarily. You still have to negotiate for that. But obviously, when we bring in these visa holders who are essentially slaves to the companies, they're willing to work these, apparently they're high-skilled jobs, but it's literally just every job. We've got accountants that are visa holders that are coming in and working for $38,000, working 80 hours a week. That's not fair to our high-skilled workers in America. It's not fair to the low-skilled workers. It's not fair to anybody. And it creates a lot of animosity between these immigrants as well as the American citizens. So, look, I think this is a very strong argument, and it's not really all that debatable. Now, there are other factors why wages are getting suppressed. We have a lot of monopolies in the United States. We have AI taking over. Companies are also getting more efficient, needing less employees. So it's not just the immigrants. I don't, when we look at wages being suppressed over the last 30, 40 years, it's not just the immigrants. That's just a part of the pie. That's one of like 4 different things that are suppressing wages and hurting worker power. Union suppression is a massive thing. AI is obviously a massive thing. Monopolies are a massive thing. But I do think the wages are a solid argument for the anti-immigration crowd. For the pro-immigration crowd, but everyone is an immigrant. Look, this is just factually true. Unless you're like some atheist that believes that, we had like people starting on every single continent, but even with that, it was Pangea. And look, especially if you're a Christian, you believe in Adam and Eve, started out in the Middle East. And yes, everybody's an immigrant to every country. That's just the fact of reality. With that being said, I don't necessarily think that rules out people from wanting to have borders. This everyone is an immigrant. People say this to Americans that don't want immigrants to come in now. They're like, well, your great grandparents were immigrants. And yes, there is a contradiction there. But does that just mean, if you're going to take this argument to the logical conclusion, does that mean no country can have any immigration borders? Is that? I don't really think that makes a ton of sense. You immigrate from state to state, you move from state. I mean, I just find it a little ridiculous. I do understand the point, and there is definitely a contradiction when you wanted to be able to, if you're Italian or like any of the more modern immigrants, you want to be able to come and America accepts you, but then you get in and you kind of pull the ladder up. So I do understand the contradiction, but at any point, any country can say, we don't want to welcome any people, and I think that's always the right of the people within the country to say, if you're an outsider, we have to decide on a case-by-case basis if we want to allow you in. And I think that's totally within their right. Anti-immigration talking point. They aren't assimilating. Now, you hear this one all the time, and I do understand it once again, but I find it very hard, number one, to legislate. When we talk about politics, we need to be talking about legislation. How can we make a law that can get passed, that can get, passed up through the courts and stuff, and actually implied? Assimilating, is that religion? Is that language? Is that attire? Is that food? Is that mannerisms? Is that hygiene? I do understand the general point, and I would say, although I haven't been alive long enough to really see a bunch of waves of immigrants, I would say there seems to be kind of a vibe shift in at least the immigrants that are on social media. The loudest ones get the most attention, and it seems like they're assimilating less. Obviously, it's not a tangible thing. I don't have any data to back that up, but it definitely does seem like they're assimilating less. I just find it as it's just a tough thing to legislate. What specifically are you asking for? And really anything you could ask for, even if you say, these are my boxes, a lot of Americans won't check those off. So I understand the point. I just don't, kind of similar to the last one, everybody's an immigrant. I understand both points. I just don't find it as something we could really act on. Now, the last pro-immigration talking point, immigrants will help increase our population. You want to keep the infamous pyramid shape. You want a lot of young people, less middle-aged people, and then even less old people. That's just how the tax base works. If you have an inverted pyramid with a lot of old people, who's going to support them with Social Security, with just working in healthcare? You want every 10 years you go younger. You want more people that are that age, if that makes sense. And look, it kind of solves the problem, but it is kind of a band-aid. Part of the reason why people aren't having kids, not all of the reason, a lot of it's cultural. A lot of women have careers and don't want to have kids, or maybe they don't want to have kids until later. I understand that. But part of the reason is financial. If both the people have to work, if both the mom and the dad have to work, it's a lot less enticing for a woman to have multiple kids if she has to work. Because now you have to pay a babysitter, she can't stay home with the kid. It's less enticing. And part of the reason that it is harder to start a family, and I'm not blaming the immigrants. I don't blame the immigrants in this. I don't think they're bad people. I would do the same thing. If you could get a better opportunity, obviously you would take it. But between the worker suppression, workers have less power for a multitude of reasons. One of the reasons is immigration, both illegal, legal, as well as visa holders. That's just one of the reasons. So, I find we need to address why Americans aren't having kids. And I'm not saying we can't have any immigrants. We obviously can have some immigrants. But to just say, the infamous leaked Hillary Clinton clip saying, we'll just get a bunch of immigrants to fill the population issue, we're just kicking it down the road and completely changing the country overnight. So I don't really love that one. Now, the last anti-immigration talking point, but our culture is changing. And this is kind of similar to the assimilation. I understand it once again. Same thing I'm going to say with the assimilation is this is very tough to legislate. If you're going to look at voting patterns, a lot of Republicans say, oh, well, they don't support the First Amendment, they don't support the Second Amendment. Okay, but it could be inverse. You've got a lot of Cubans in Florida that are very Republican, a lot of Hispanics are turning Republican, and it's soon going to be kind of a 50-50 wash. So obviously immigrants are always changing in terms of their ideology and specifically what immigrants come in. And what would be even the ideal culture? Obviously we have quite a bit of diversity, but when the Irish came in, when the Italians came in, when Japanese people came in, it kind of gets said every single time, oh, but they're going to change the culture. Oh, but they're going to change the culture. I think in an ideal system, obviously we can't legislate this, which is what I was talking about, the issue. But in an ideal system, it's kind of a 90-10 thing. If you're going to come into the country, the expectation is you accept kind of our style of life 90% and you bring some things with you. So I think that could kind of be the standard, but to just say they have a bad culture, we have the good culture, it just is kind of insulting to the immigrants. It's like, well, everything about our culture is bad. So I don't love that. Now, I've got some critiques for both parties, as well as what I would do if I was the emperor. So first thing for the Democrats, number one, have a clear plan. I think you have to say, if you're going to be pro-immigration, which at this point it's becoming a little untenable at this current moment, but if you are going to be pro-immigration, I think you need to say, we are going to bring in no more than 1 million immigrants. We'll have 300,000 visa holders come in, we'll have 700,000 legal immigrants, and we're going to have, obviously you don't plan for any illegals to come in, and I think you also need to stop calling people that are anti-immigration racist. Now, some are, for sure, but I don't think saying that you want to keep your country, as it currently is racist. Now, for the Republicans, I think you need to drop the cruelty. A lot of the Republican talking points are, doing edits over people getting deported and families getting broken up. Look, you can support deportations, that's fine, but the cruelty, it's a little unnecessary. The blatant racism and xenophobia that some Republicans do enact. I just said Democrats shouldn't call them racist, but some of them are extremely cruel about it. So I think those are critiques for both sides. Now, in terms of my plan, I would do an immigration moratorium for 10 years. No immigrants come in. Maybe we can have under 1,000, like literally 1,000 immigrants. If we got an NBA player that's coming over, if we've got a movie star, if we've got something special, okay. But immigration moratorium, that's going to help the immigrants that are currently here assimilate. Number one, that's very important. In terms of the illegals, look, I don't think it's feasible to deport these people. It's very expensive. It's, in a lot of cases, immoral. It causes a commotion. It causes protest. I think what you do with the illegals is you make them legal. Look, you don't think it's fair? Okay, we don't have a better option. Republicans are going to complain. Democrats are going to say, what do you mean you're going to do an immigration moratorium? That's what we're going to do. In terms of the Republicans, they're going to say, but that's not fair. These people came over illegally. We need to deport them. It's like, look, it's just not feasible. It's just not feasible. You have to accept the reality. I think this is a win for both sides. The Democrats can say, look, we're going to save all these illegals. They're going to become legal. They're going to pay back taxes. They're going to pledge allegiance to America. And the Republicans get their immigration moratorium for 10 years, and then we reevaluate. So I think both sides will win with that plan. Unironically, that is kind of the opposite of what's happening. The Republicans are doing kind of makeshift deportations, posting Katy Perry edits. It's completely ridiculous. And the Democrats, if they get back in power, are probably going to bring in a bunch of immigrants. So it's a total mess. Even right now, we still have a bunch of immigrants flowing in, even under this, xenophobic and racist administration, which a lot of people consider it, and it's just a total mess. Immigration's a total mess.